Um, my book, which you can hopefully see on the screen, is entitled The Great Windships. And it is a 500-year history of how the various economic, social, commercial forces drove the development of sailing ships from the beginning of the 15th century through well into the 20th century. But because of time restrictions this evening, I'm going to concentrate on the period from 1815 roughly through to 1914, 1815 being significant because it was the year Napoleon was defeated. And for the next 100 years, the world got down to some pretty serious money making. And it was, as far as sailing ships were concerned, the main factor was the application of steam power to cotton weaving mills in England, as you probably all know, was the most advanced industrial country at the time. That application of steam vastly increased the output potential of the weaving machines installed in England. And of course, that led to a dramatic increase in the demand for cotton, so much so that cotton production expanded, or cultivation expanded, from the East Coast of the United States into the vast flatlands of the Mississippi Delta. And the cotton would be picked from there. It would be transported through the Gulf of Mexico, around Florida, and up to New York. Up until that time, the cargo connection between New York and the UK had been the main purpose of the trade, was to take cotton from New York and into Liverpool, and from Liverpool it could be transported quite easily to Manchester. The implication also of this vastly increased area of cotton was that the slave trade absolutely boomed. And even though trading in slaves had been banned in Britain in 1807, it was poorly policed, and particularly in America, where they were not interested in policing the trade, because the United States at that time was primarily an agricultural economy and relied very heavily on slaves to grow tobacco, cotton, sugar, all of those agricultural products. So slaving became a very important trade in the United States. But from my point of view here, it is I'm talking about the liner services, and those liner services ships were very small. The ship shown here was called the Superior, and she was an early ship of the Black Ball line. There were a number of lines. The number of liner services sailing specifically from England to Europe multiplied very quickly. She's an early blackballer. She's only 400 tons. Now, as marine architects, you may or may not know that the ship's carrying capacity or size was gauged through the number of tons, TUNS, which was a large barrel of port which could be transported from Portugal to England, and how many of those so-called tons a ship could carry. That was how it was measured, and that was how it was taxed. That system of measurement subsequently transformed from a volumetric measurement into a mass measurement in that one cask contained 918 litres. Adding on the weight of the cask, it came up to 2,240 pounds, and hence the traditional British tonne. But we're talking here about tonnes old measure. These ships, they set out and they sailed to timetables. They were manned by an unruly bunch of sailors that were Liverpool Irish. They were drunken, mutinous, difficult to control, but they prided themselves in being able to sail these ships absolutely flat out in the worst of weathers. And surprisingly, over time, they achieved 25 days out of New York into Liverpool, assisted by the Gulf Stream, of course. When they were coming back, they had to swing south, so the voyage was longer, and they didn't pick up the Gulf Stream until near the end of their voyage. And the times there averaged about 43 days. The trade was extraordinarily lucrative, and it triggered a shipbuilding boom. These ships were called the Western Ocean packets. Here we see the Great Western. She's another black baller, a packet, but she is 1,600 tons. So she's 4 times the size, and she was sailing on within a decade after that very small ship that we saw earlier. But the trade benefited enormously very shortly from famine in Ireland, which led to the near starvation of a great many people and depopulation, wholesale depopulation of Ireland, to the point where there were enormous numbers of people that they needed to get out of Ireland and certainly not into England, but into America. And this gave the cotton packets a back trade, a back freight, which made them enormously profitable. The ships would bring bales of cotton into Liverpool. They would be equipped with very basic accommodation facilities, crammed with people, and then they set out with these people that were half-starved, disease-ridden quite often, and many of them would die. Up to 17% of them would die on the trip across and be cast overboard. Those that were strong enough got to England, but this trade was assisted also by, from 1849 on, the nationalist revolutions that were occurring in the various nation states of Europe, and people sought to escape the very repressive regimes that followed on those revolutions. And so you get a large number of people from Europe, as well as those poor starving people coming out of Ireland, who want to get across to America, the land of the free. So the packets were sailed very hard. The way that they sought to increase the speed was by simply cramming on more sail. And you see there that this ship has actually got sails backed because it's awaiting the pilot off probably New York. And that is what is known as a fully rigged ship. In other words, 3 masts, all square rigged, headsails, prominent headsails, and also a fore and aft sail called a jigger on the back. These sails were used to assist in manoeuvring the ship because, in relation to the size of the ship, the rudders were really quite small. Just pardon me for a minute. I would mention at this stage that getting that cotton from the Mississippi Delta out through New Orleans and into New York was the job of ships that were called drogers. And these ships, of necessity, had minimum dead rise. In other words, their bottom was almost flat. And that was because the Gulf of Mexico, close into New Orleans, is very shallow. And so the ships were made to suit the trade. Those drogers, it was subsequently found, were actually quite fast. And this was the beginning of the thinking that the shape of the hull had as much to do with the speed of the ship as the sail that could be crammed onto the masts. And the designers who, and there were relatively few of them, but they were extraordinarily gifted people. One in particular, Donald Mackay, which we'll have more to say about later. the next stage of development, and it derives almost directly out of the Western Ocean packets. These Western Ocean packets were built in America. England, up until 1849, had placed restrictions on the length to beam ratio of a ship because there was such a large proportion of the state's revenue was derived from customs duty. Smuggling was extraordinarily profitable. And in order to cut down on the amount of smuggling, they limited the length to beam ratio of the ship so that the government ships that were sent to apprehend them could catch them. The French, of course, took no notice of that, and they were really quite on the cutting edge of small ship design, and they had realized that the speed of a ship is directly related to the length of the hull. And so they were building ships that were longer than the English ships. And this persisted. England persisted in this up until 1849, when what were called the Navigation Acts, by which the measurement of the ship was limited. The Navigation Acts were repealed, and the English, in the meantime, had realized that they had fallen behind in merchant ship design. They were very good at naval ship design, but naval ships were never designed for speed. They were designed for carrying cannon and being able to blow the what's-her-name out of the opposition. And the Americans, meanwhile, who were designing these Western Ocean packets, they had been experimenting with rigs and subsequently with hull design, and they realized that it was a combination of a big rig, which the Americans were very good at because they only had one speed, really, and that was flat out. They did not rig down at night, whereas the English were prone to rigging down at night. And the Americans had realized in the slave trade that the only way to get away from the English warships that were sent to police the trade was to sail with all of the sails up 24 hours a day. That became known as the cult of hard driving. And they also made ships that were, they also built ships that were able to make up to windward further or better than the equivalent British ship. So the Americans are on the forefront of merchant sailing ship design. So can I use this? Not working. The designers of these packets immediately gold was discovered in California, which was in 1849. They realized that they needed a bigger ship, and they needed one that was extremely fast. This led to quite a few innovations. They were really consolidating on the lessons of design that they'd learned from the packets. But the big stimulus was the need to get people from the east coast of the United States to the west coast. At that stage, the only way to get from New York into San Francisco was around Cape Horn. So you needed a big ship, and the faster that ship was, the more money you would make because of the eagerness of the gold seekers to get there as soon as they possibly could. And when they first started out, it was taking 110 days, sometimes 120 days, but they eventually got it down to 90 days, and in a couple of notable cases, even less, which is really quite extraordinary. What you see here is a picture, is an image, pardon me, of Donald Mackay's Sovereign of the Seas. She is an out-and-out clipper. You can get some appreciation from the amount of sail that ship has, and it was recorded over a short distance at 22 knots, and it's about 45 kilometres an hour. So you can imagine 2,000 or 3,000 tons dead weight of ship bowling along at 45 kilometres an hour, and they would be hanging onto her, I imagine, by grim death. But these ships, because they combined these enormous rigs with innovations in hull design, that they became the fastest merchant ships ever. The Sovereign of the Seas that we see here, she travelled the furthest across the face of the earth that mankind had ever travelled in a day up until that time, 465 nautical miles, which works out at about 19.4 knots. Now, for those of you who are yachties, when Comanche won the Sydney to Hobart in 2017, she sailed this 628 nautical miles at an average of 19.4 knots. And she had the advantage of a great deal of technology that simply was not available to these people. These ships were really quite extraordinary. Now, that ship was designed by a chap called Donald Mackay. He was an enormously successful ship designer. He was a Nova Scotian. He came first to Boston to ply his trade and then moved to New York because New York was where the ships are being built. And although it's hard to imagine today, they were doing most of it on what is the east coast of Manhattan Island, down near Smith Street, which is where all the big shipyards were. And a combination of those and some very enterprising shipbuilders, these very good designers, they started to turn out a very large number of these clipper ships. The Americans were so good at building merchant ships that by the mid-1850s, they were transporting more merchandise. They were the largest merchandise transporters in the world, bigger than England because England had stuck with the Navigation Acts, which was a very mercantilist system, and their restricted approach to ship design. But the history was about to overtake them, and we'll go into that in just a moment. This is another Donald Mackay design. As you can see, she is another an enormous ship, and she's got all those stunsails that you can see outside the conventional rig. They were set when the ship was anticipating being in a wind system for quite some time. They could set those stunsails, and it gave the ship an enormous power. The Lightning has an association with Australia. As a matter of fact, she's still here. In the early 1850s, she'd been built for an English shipbuilder, sorry, an English ship owner called James Baines, and he had Lightning built because shortly after the Californian gold rush, gold was discovered in Victoria, as you probably all be aware. It was the largest gold rush, or the largest freight, produced more gold than any gold rush in the world up until that time. So the number of people who wanted to get from America or from anywhere in the world into Australia, they wanted to do it very quickly because this was a very lucrative field. Lightning was one of those ships. She was bringing gold seekers from England, and she came into Port Phillip Bay to Geelong. She was moored there, and unfortunately she caught fire. But these are wooden ships. They're made out of wood and essentially sailcloth, so they're extraordinarily flammable. She caught fire. She burned to the waterline. she had to be sunk by cannon fire because she was a hazard to navigation, lying just below the level of the surface of the sea. And she resides to this day in Port Phillip Bay, adjacent, I think it's Hobson's Bay at Geelong. She's still there. I actually spoke to a guy who went down and brought up one of the anchors off her. And so she's obviously still there. The next, all of this gold seeking and being able to supply these distant gold fields made it very lucrative for the British shipping industry, sorry, I beg your pardon, the American ship construction industry. But these ships are built out of softwood. They waterlogged fairly quickly. They became waterlogged fairly quickly, and these enormous rigs strained the hull because structurally you've only got timber in order to manipulate these enormous forces generated in these big sailing rigs. And so the clippers did have their disadvantages. Although they were the fastest sailing ships ever built, they had their limitations. And the wily British, of course, were very, they recognized this all too well. The construction of these ships to serve these gold rushes led to a boom in ship construction, primarily in Boston, but more so in New York. And in 1853, I think, they built 300, I just get the number right, but I think 381 ships were built on the east coast of America. Now, that's an incredible boom in ship construction. It led invariably to a bust. And in 1857, that bust took place. The whole industry collapsed. But before it did collapse, one of the versatility of these ships, they would sail from New York around Cape Horn. They would take a cargo of merchandise and gold seekers into San Francisco. From San Francisco, if they still had a crew, if they hadn't deserted to go to the gold fields, then they would sail from there to China. In China, they would pick up tea, and then they would complete the voyage around the world by sailing from there to England. The British believed that the less time tea spent on salt water, the better it tasted. Whether or not that was true, nobody ever found out, but it meant that the clippers, who were much faster than the English ships that were trying to get tea out of China into England, they could get £6 sterling a ton freight, whereas the English ships were getting £2 or £3. So it was extraordinarily lucrative. But the time they got to England, they had to be dry docked. When they were dry docked, the British naval architects would be down there and they would be taking the lines off very assiduously because they wanted to find out how it was these ships could achieve these incredible speeds. But as I said, there was an enormous boom in shipbuilding. The boom burst. There was depression, recession in the run-up to 1861 when the American Civil War broke out, and that changes everything again. All of the young, following the Civil War, which was 1861, 1865, 1866, the young people in the United States didn't want to go to sea again. They wanted to follow the frontier, and this is the age of the mythical age of the cowboy and the great move to colonize the vast area between the east and west coasts of America. And this led to a decline in the American shipping industry, and it was one that they really didn't recover from. They were building ships called Downeasters up in Nova Scotia subsequently, but really America had surrendered the crown of being the best shipbuilders in the world. Now, England had, as I said, they had assiduously taken off the lines of these clippers when they were dry docked in London. And with the enormous boom and bust in America, and really the demise of the clipper ships. They were stuck in that they were no longer able to get the tea that they needed, so they had to build their own clipper ships. And bearing in mind, you build a clipper because you wanted to get there and back as fast as you could. And these, the result, these are two British tea clippers, very famous tea clippers, the Ariel and the Taiping, and they're battling it out up the English Channel. And there were 4 of these that left China more or less within a day or 2 of each other. And they were in the offing in London within a day or so. 2 of them, the Ariel and the Taiping, were only, I think, 30 minutes apart. And there was a prize for who won. And the skipper of, I think it was the Ariel that won the race, but the prize money was shared with the Taiping. But the British were able to change. The next big development was, even though they were sticking with the hull design, which was critical, and putting these vast rigs on, and you can see they're imitating the Americans there in the size of the rig, and they would be sailing 24 hours a day rather than rigging down at night, just the same cold and hard driving as had been initiated by the Americans. The difference was England was considerably more industrially advanced than was America. So instead of trying to build a ship out of wood and all of the structural strutting and beams and structural members that would be need to keep a wooden ship withstanding the strains generated by the rigs, the Americans, the English, could cast the frames in iron, and not only the frames, but the pillars that supported the masts. And so they opened up the inside of the ship enormously. And so the ships could, they were easier to work because they didn't have all this structural stuff inside them. They were clad in the beautiful hardwood timbers that England by this time was bringing from India and Burma, teak and mahogany, particularly mahogany. So they would be clad topsides with mahogany. And then another advantage that the British had is that they could make sheet bronze and or copper sheeting, and they could clad the hull below the waterline to stop the depredations of the teredo worm, which were the bane of the American clippers, which were built out of wood and not clad. The English also innovated with the rigs because they weren't sailing around Cape Horn and then to San Francisco and across to China. They had to make their way to China through the tropics and then come back through the tropics. And so they innovated considerably with the rigs to make these ships more able to cope with the low winds and low wind systems that you encounter in the tropics, going, but not only going to China, but coming back again. Now, this is the epitome of the Britain's tea clippers. That's the Cutty Sark. And you can see she's a magnificent ship, and the height of the mast is incredible. And she was perhaps, as I say there in the title, the epitome of the great English, Great Britain's tea clippers. Unfortunately, she was designed and she was launched in 1869. It just so happens that in 1869, the Suez Canal was opened. And so this allowed the steamers to get through to China, and the sailing ships were not able to use the Suez. They had to go around the Cape of Good Hope. And so essentially their days were numbered in the tea trade. The Cutty Sark, actually, she did make several trips to China, but she was subsequently confined to bringing immigrants to Australia. They would come into Melbourne. All the clipper ships would come into Melbourne because it was the easiest port. But it paid to have your navigation right when you're coming through Bass Strait. And they would then load wool, and they would take wool back to England. And that was essentially, she survived for quite a few years, and as many of you no doubt know, she's up on the Hard at Greenwich in Sydney and in London, and you can inspect her. She's one of the few clipper ships. None of, to my knowledge, of the American wooden clipper ships survived. They were just simply not built to last a very long time. The next big development in merchant shipping involves ships here. This is the Herzegovina Cecily, and she is a bark. As you can see, she's square rigged on 3 masts, and she is also has a 4.5 jigger on the stern, as well as a bunch of headsels. These ships were made of steel. They originated in the northern part of England. England by this time was building steamships, was supplying the world really with steamships. And in order to accommodate a reciprocating steam engine, the ships had to be built firstly of iron, but then later of steel. It was very easy to take that technology and apply it to sailing ships. But if you've got steam can stick to schedules. They may not be as fast as the sailing ships, but they are dependable. So why do you need another big sailing ship? Well, the answer lies in agriculture. At the latter part of the 19th century, the population in Europe was growing very quickly. It was outrunning the fertility of the agricultural land. And the innovation was to bring first guano from tropical islands into England. And many of the old clipper ships actually finished their days bringing guano from islands off South America into Europe. But the demand for nitrate, nitrogenous fertilizer or nitrate, was so great that it wasn't long before the British took to exploiting the natural nitrate occurring deposits of the Atacama Desert. The Atacama Desert is naturally inland, so they had to get the nitrate to the coast. But once they got it to the coast, they needed a sailing ship to get it to England. And the simple reason was that a steamer could not risk going back around Cape Horn and being overtaken by a wave. Now, Cape Horn is notorious for the size of the seas. And if it brought a steamer's funnel down, the water would get down into the boiler and the ship would be useless. And so sailing ships found a calling, bringing this nitrate from a number of nitrate ports along the North Chilean coast and some of them into Peru. It was difficult to get cargoes to go out there because there was practically nothing on the west coast of South America. Some of the ships, as we will see later, they brought freight into Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and then they would set off and round Cape Horn and go to the nitrate ports. And Herzegovina Cecily was a very famous one of those. She was a beautiful ship, and she was very fast, and she spent the last of her days, sailing days, actually coming to Australia because the nitrate trade, just the same as the Suez Canal, had defeated the clipper ships in handling tea cargo from China to England. So the advent of the Panama Canal would allow the steamers through to the west coast of South America. 2 factors, actually. The steamers could get to the nitrate fields, but also Germany had invented an industrial process to produce nitrate. Now, I just want to backpedal a little bit there. The reason why England began building ships in iron and in steel was the advent of the shell, which is a package of a projectile, and the propellant. The advent of the propellant of the shell, as opposed to the cannonball, and rifled gun barrels, meant that was the end of the age of wooden ships, because they were just so vulnerable to this sort of armament that they had to start building ships out of steel. And so, sorry, iron in the beginning, but because steel was cheaper. Once they got the process was improved, that was what had led to the development of first iron and steel warships, then iron and steel steamers, and then iron and steel sailing ships. So this, whilst the clipper era was the great and romantic age of the sailing ship, the windjammers, as these ships were called, was the actual last iteration of the merchant sailing ship. This particular ship here, it's France. She was the largest of the French windjammers, and as you can see, she's a 5-master. So she's got 4 square-rigged sails, and she's got a jigger on the stern. They needed those jiggers, as I said before, to steer them, because the ratio between the size of the rudder and the length of the ship, they were just inadequate to actually maneuver the ship. The name windjammer, there are various explanations, but one of the explanations is that it was very difficult to jam them up into the wind. When you've got so many square rig sails, it's very difficult to get a square rig sail up into the wind. So that supposedly is the explanation. Now, Britain was by far the biggest shipbuilder in the world. She was building something, I think 92% of the world's steamers were being built in the north of England, and primarily on the Clyde, but also in Ireland and some on the northeast coast of England. And during this time, it was realised that very large ships like this were really not viable. The 4-masted bark was the ideal combination. The square rig sails, the ones that do the heavy lifting, and the ideal configuration, it was very soon arrived at, was the 4-masted bark. And England built something like 468 of these 4-masted barks. And because they were, some built of iron, but subsequently of steel, many of them survived. And they're scattered around the world today as restaurants, or I've been aboard one in Sweden that is a youth hostel, but they're still floating and they're still maintained. And one of them, Mishula, which we'll get to in a minute, she was very famous, and she's a restaurant in Pennsylvania. As I said, these ships were initially the nitrate trade, but when the steamers stole the nitrate trade, they then had to find other trades in order to sustain them. The British and the Germans, who were the biggest market for nitrate, they were competing against each other and subsidizing the production of these very large sailing ships to be able to get as much nitrate as possible back to Europe. The nitrate was being used A, for fertilizer, but B, also for armaments, because those shells that I mentioned before, they needed nitrate as a propellant. And we're in the lead up, the battle of the great battleships in the lead up to the First World War. And so nitrate had a really big market in Europe. This is the largest sailing ship that was ever built. She was a German, so you see now we've got France and England competing because they're subsidising the production of these ships. England opts out. England was building, supplying the world with steamships, and so I think the attitude was a plague on both your houses. We'll forget about building sailing ships. We'll concentrate on steamships. And so the production of sailing ships has taken over. In France, they were heavily subsidized, and in Germany, they were subsidized as well. This is the Preußen II. As you can see, 5 masts, square rigged, very much a windjammer. Unfortunately, she didn't last all that long. Coming from Germany down the English Channel and on its way to the west coast of South America, the cross-channel steamers had difficulty in judging the speed of these enormous ships because there's no noise, and they were constantly only just escaping across the front of the bow until the inevitable happened. The Preußen T-boned a steamer. It brought down her bowsprit. She was towed into Dover. She had a cargo of grand pianos going to Argentina because the German instrument makers believed that the reciprocating engines on a steamship spoiled the tune or tone of their machines, so they preferred to transport their pianos on sailing ships. They unloaded all the grand pianos, but unfortunately for Preußen II, she was sitting over the top of a large rock in Dover Harbour. A storm blew up. She was bouncing up and down on that rock, and she broke her back and she sank. And you can still see her, or what's left of her, at low tide. The next really, or the twilight, if you like, of sailing power was a chap called Gustav Erikson. He was a Scandinavian, a native of the Åland Islands. He loved sailing ships. After the First World War, the most successful sailing line in the world up until that time was called the Flying P line, a German line. And all of those ships were, their names began with P. And it was a very successful sailing line. But as part of the reparations of the First World War, which were particularly pernicious, all of these ships were given to everybody else, or given to a great number of other countries, many of whom had no use for them and didn't even know how to operate them. And so this chap called Gustav Erikson, he came along and he hoovered up all of these ships into what was probably the largest fleet of sailing ships the world has known. And he would crew them with kids, and he would use them in trades. Well, particularly one of the most notorious trades was bringing grain from South Australia back to Europe. This particular ship, she happened to be in New York Harbour when the First World War broke out. She was commandeered, renamed Moshulu after an Indian tribe, and she was one of the ships that was subsequently owned by Gustav Erikson. As you can see, it's a 4-masted bark. It's the ideal rig. Just as a little bit of sentimentality, I mentioned those P ships, all called P. One of them was called Pamir. She was a very famous ship. I don't know whether I actually mentioned it, but they would come into Spencer Gulf in South Australia. They would load wheat. They'd come out in ballast. They would load wheat. They had to take the ballast ashore. They would load wheat, and then they would race back to England. And they were known as the great grain races. And there's a very notable book called The Last Grain Race. And if you're interested in sailing ships, it's well worth the read. It's a wonderful ship, and it very much describes what it's like to sail these enormous ships in conditions such as around Cape Horn. What we see here in this last picture is Sydney Harbour, and that is Pamir. She's probably brought softwood, what they called Oregon, because it came from the west coast of the United States. And she had found a calling bringing softwood out of the west coast of the United States into Australia, because we didn't have radiata pine in those days. We just had hardwood. And so softwood had to be imported. And this is, I think it's a Damien Pera picture of the tug Hero, and he's towing Palmyra up Sydney Harbour. She was subsequently, she had loaded barley, I think it was in Buenos Aires, and she was sailing back to Europe with barley. The ship was undermanned, poorly manned. They hadn't put in the necessary divisions within the ship to stop the grain shifting. She was hit with a storm off the Azores. She sank. Only 6 people survived. After that maritime disaster, sailing ships couldn't obtain marine insurance anymore, and that effectively ended the great era of merchant sail. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. How'd we go, Don?
Yeah, you have it.